welcome back to the AFL High Performance Podcast. My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host, and today I'm lucky enough to have Matthew Toohey here. We'll be discussing everything you need to know from regards to strength and conditioning coaching pro sport, but also the private sector, key insights into NRL rehab, as well as working in high performance teams. Welcome, Matt. Thanks for jumping on, mate. Looking forward to our chat.
Cheers, Jack. Good to be here, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for jumping on, mate, especially on a Saturday afternoon. Appreciate your time. But
Not a drama.
I guess easy way to start, mate, is kick it off with a bit of a background. I guess, where did your passion start for high performance sport? Take us right back to the start, but then also your different experiences you've had along the way.
Yeah, sure. Probably a more cliche story than most, to be honest. It hasn't been too many unusual paths. It's one that everyone sort of talks about how they get into SSE because they started as an athlete who didn't make it, and similar sort of thing. I always probably trended towards the training side and liked the training side. And I started off, one of my first jobs was ever job was a tennis coach. So I've sort of always, that was when I was 14 or 15. So always enjoyed coaching, always enjoyed the gym, always probably was more of a good trainer than I was skillful athlete, like most S&Cs, and it's sort of trended from there. And then career-wise, very stereotypical progression. Studied an undergrad, went to uni, got a chance to do a internship in my last year of uni at the Newcastle Knights, and then moved into pathways, semi-pro pathways roles, semi-pro for a period of time before getting my first full-time role. So it was probably a very natural progression through things, and then spent majority of my time in the NRL at the Newcastle Knights over a few different roles, pathways roles, and then NRL roles, assistant, and then in the rehab space, and then moved on to the New Zealand Warriors, where I was for the last few years. And then I transitioned out of pro sport in the last 12 months to enter the private sector and moved back home to Newcastle. So wasn't something I thought I was going to do probably this soon. I knew I wasn't going to be in the pro sport till I retired, but probably thought I was going to stay a little bit longer, but it was just a family decision in the end, really, that probably brought us home to Newcastle. I don't know if you've ever been here before, but it's a tough place to stay away from for too long as well. It's a nice place to live. So made a little bit of a transition into the private space. Business partner and I, Cam Dyer, who've opened up a company called RAF Sports, which is a physio, rehab, S&C, even Gen Pop. It's probably we'd probably discussed this for a long period of time, so it was probably a long time in the making. We worked together originally at the Newcastle Knights. He was a physio intern at the same time I was an S&C intern, 2010, and we'd stayed close ever since, and sort of always angled towards working together again. And sort of the timing was right that I was moving back from New Zealand. He'd been working in the Super Rugby as the head physio at the Waratahs for a number of years, and he was moving to Newcastle as well. So sort of stars aligned for us to get together and start this venture, which has been exciting over the last few months. I just lost you for a second there, mate. If I can hear you, you paused on me. There you go. I think I got you back.
Yeah, sorry, I just had a bit of internet back in. Yeah, fantastic. That's good. And that obviously working in those two different environments to have been your strongest influences, both for professional sport, but also, again, guys like Cam that in the private sector as well that have been, influences on your philosophy and, I guess your principles with how you go about working as a strength and conditioning coach, both in rehab, but also in performance.
Yeah, I was extremely lucky early on. I think there is a lot of luck in it early on in terms of where you get your first opportunity. I think about young students progressing out and where they get there. They might be serving internships and they're a little bit naive to the world and things. And I was just probably purely out of luck. The staff that was at the Newcastle Knights at the time when I was in my third year and graduated into that internship were an amazing group of staff that I was able to be mentored by. I worked in a junior pathways role in that internship, and we had a guy who's Simon Harries, who you've had on the podcast before. He was working there at the time. Tim Rogers was sort of taking a lead in that pathway space, and he's been a strong mentor of mine. And then we had Lee Clark, who was the head of performance for the NRL program at the time. They were all brilliant for me. That transitioned into Adam Tripaz, has also had a lot of experience internationally rugby league, and that he was just happy to be back in Newcastle and took on a part-time role, looking after some of the pathway stuff as well. So probably a lot of luck that I fell into an environment that was amazing for me from a mentor's perspective. And I could have, at any other time, I could have fallen into an environment with other people and probably not have been as lucky, and my career could have turned out very differently. So, and I don't think those mentors were necessarily people who just fed me heaps of information. They were people who challenged you to think critically. They gave you the resources to sort of figure it out for yourself a little bit, and gave you opportunities to coach and learn and make mistakes. It wasn't like they just force-fed their philosophies and their structure and how they wanted to do things down your throat, which I think probably made me develop better as a coach, being able to think critically myself and analyze things a little bit differently. And they challenge you a lot more rather than just, there's probably some people who had experiences where early on in their career, senior coaches might have just, this is the way to do things and this is how we do it sort of situation. So I was probably just out of pure luck that I fell into that environment in the final year of uni, that I was due to do a internship, that those were the guys that were there. So although I only had 1 year under them and the staff changed to move on, that was a great experience for me. And I still stay in touch with those guys. Tim Rogers actually ended up taking a head of pathways academy role at the Warriors in the last year I was there, which was a bit full circle for me as well. So it's good to work with him again. And then moving on in later years, I had a really good opportunity staff-wise at the Knights, our high-performance manager, Balin Couples, and we had some really good physios and staff around us at that time that were influential in how I thought about things and challenged me. And especially when I transitioned into the rehab space, we had Lou Cutler was the rehab physio and Phil Bossum was the head physio. They were really amazing for me. It was sort of a role that I hadn't worked in before, and the opportunity presented itself. I'd been in more junior roles as assistant and then lead S&C with our New South Wales Cup team and assistant S&C roles, and then the rehab role became available, and Balin asked me whether I was keen on jumping into that rehab role, and I am very grateful for the opportunities he gave me. Similar to the last guys, he was very, very good manager in regards to letting us do things the way we wanted to do them, but also making sure we were accountable for what we were doing. And he was definitely across everything, and he'd always challenge you and ask questions, but he wasn't overbearing or micromanaging in any way, which was amazing for me stepping into that rehab role. Which is why then when the opportunity presented itself, he left to go to the Warriors, and I followed him over there in a senior S&C role as well. So we had a really good working relationship for a number of years and really enjoyed and learned a lot from him. I think he's someone you're going to be chatting to in the next few weeks, so that'll be an insightful one for all the listeners as well.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, no, we've got one on in a few weeks. It'll be quite timely. And that jump, I guess, from which can be quite, like you mentioned, working your way up from internships, experience, and then junior pathways, and then typically it is reconditioning, then strength and power and high performance, but the other way around and bits and pieces. But how did you find that? I guess jump or just different responsibilities where you are working close with the medical team and coaches with the return to performance, where perhaps with, I guess, in athlete population, it is generally more general, and it probably more around teaching, education and fundamentals. I guess with rehab, it's a little bit more specific and individualized, a bit more niche. Yeah. So how did you find that transition? And for coaches out there, is there anything you wish you had from an experience point of view, whether it be maybe managing rehab in pathways, or is there any experiences you wish you had to help, I guess, make an impact in that role, the rehab role, working with professional athletes? Or did you feel that it's just something you have to do to get better at it? The role itself develops?
Probably, combination of both. I think you can be prepared up to a point, and then it's probably a point where you just need to jump in the deep end and get your hands dirty with it a little bit, and hope that the people that are working around you are good people and put trust in you and help you with the decision making, I suppose. I was very lucky, again, probably more good luck than good management, that I worked in roles that made me a lot more of a generalist early. So after my internship, I worked 5 years part-time, like semi-pro, before I got my first full-time role. So those roles were a conditioning role in the pathways, and I worked a strength role in the pathways part-time, and then I actually went away and I was the lead head S&C for a New South Wales Cup team, the Warangaroos, which for the year were the Roosters feeder club at the time. So similar to working head of S&C, head of performance for a VFL team. I did that for 2 years, which gave me the opportunity to sort of work closely with physios, obviously at that point, and worked across some rehab at that stage. Strength conditioning is one of those jobs where you just have to do everything. Sports science, you're doing the GPS and things like that as well. So I think that allowed me to have a very broad scope on those things, but which when it came time to that niche down a little bit, you can call on a number of skill sets that I suppose you've been exposed to. After that, Weimaru's New South Wales Cup roles, when I moved into my full-time role, when I was the head of performance for the Pathways. And I did that for a number of years before progressing to the NRL role. So again, you get used to discussing conversations with coaches, other staff, managing rehab setting, although in a Pathways environment, reserve grade, under 20, 16s, 18s. So there's definitely things you can do to prep yourself in that perspective, both in your role and educationally, externally from your role. But then there's a point where you probably get thrown in the mix a little bit and just have to be doing your best in the early stages while you're continuing to learn. If that's so to answer probably your question, it's a bit of both, really. There's an element of, I think you can prepare to a point until you're really in that. Especially even don't know how you found it, but changing codes, I think you've been in a rehab role in an AFL environment for a period of time, and then there's probably just an element of jumping codes in the NRL that regardless of how much you knew prior, you probably just have to be in that to get that experience. And it's similar from a career progression with that as well, I feel. I think the rehab role is an outstanding role from a development perspective. You learn so much, and you have to work across all domains. You have to be factoring in so many elements. Get to build relationships and work closely with players that put a lot of trust in you. You have to obviously handle the strength side and the conditioning side and the speed side a lot of times. You're dealing with integration and around loads and return to run progression and integrating into training. Are they going to be conditioned enough you're happy to perform when they return and things like that as well. So I think it's probably the role out of all of them that prepares you the most to take on more senior S&C roles and high performance manager roles, because you just get such a broad scope across the whole spectrum. And then when you progress in those roles, I think you get a lot of buy-in from players that you've had good experiences with, that you've worked closely with, that you have key relationships with as well. So if anyone, I'm a huge advocate for anyone having an opportunity for a rehab role. I think even if it's something you don't want to do long term, I think it's an outstanding progression from a career perspective to get a grasp of the whole picture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think early days, it was certainly like with relaying it back to like a VFL system, like it's something that I wish I had took on more. It was typically the physios that managed rehab in that particular club, but I think having S&Cs at all level, wherever you're working at grassroots, juniors, or in pro sport, it's good to be involved in the rehab process and work closely with the physios and the athlete. So naturally, when it's your first opportunity doing it, can be quite daunting because you're probably learning new jargon with the medical team, with scans and bits and pieces, but it's worth diving into. I couldn't agree. Yeah, there's probably no other time where you actually get to periodize and individualize. And like you said, you're working on speed development, agility, integration into football. So you got to understand the sport, working close with the coaches, medical team, understanding pathology. So it's just endless, the amount of growth that you get. There's always an area that you could probably get better at as you grow and get more experience. So I think
the other two sides to that, mate, is there's probably no other area where you get more control in terms of being able to control all the variables in decision making around. You've got them separate from the main squad for a large period of time, so when they return, there can be at the mercy of skills coaches and drills and how that session played out a little bit. So there's probably no time you get to control all the variables, which makes you probably a better decision maker around things. And the second part of that is there's a high amount of scrutiny on your role, because especially if you get a key player that you need to return in a quick period of time, there's going to be a lot of judgment from not only within the club but externally from the club, media, supporters around how that player returned from injury. So it's a high pressure role realistically around you making good decisions to effectively not only focusing on the injury but the athlete's ability to perform when they return from that injury. And you can come under a lot of scrutiny for things if you're not executing your role well. So probably gets you good experience with dealing with a little bit of that pressure as well.
100%. Yeah. you're dealing with probably the players that are injured, so they're most vulnerable to injury because they're currently injured, or they've got a long history of injured, so they're the highest risk population of the group. So yeah, there's great learning that comes of it. That's quite a good segue actually for the next question, mate. Biggest challenges, obviously, working at world-class environments. Like you said, there's pressure. Everyone's pushing boundaries and wanting to be their best. What do you feel has been the biggest challenges you face so far in your career, and what did you learn, or how'd you grow from facing those challenges?
Yeah, there's probably 3 different periods I can think of. There was a period at the Knights, obviously, where we weren't doing very well, which was a very big growth area across the whole club, the roster, coaching staff. So there was a lot of pressure in a lot of different areas, not necessarily specifically on me, but just on the results. When your whole club's not doing well, there's always going to be scrutiny around everything you're doing. So there's different elements of that. And heavy around that same time, there was a lot of turnover of staff. So you sort of felt like in a year there was a new high performance manager every year, and there was new other S&Cs, and so you're trying to develop relationships and sort of understand where you fit into the picture. And so there was challenging times just getting to understand how to work with people, I think, is another key challenge that people will come across, once you get yourself established potentially and you're in a really good group and you're together for a period of time. That's obviously an awesome thing to be a part of, but at times there's going to be coach brings in his own right-hand man, or then they leave and someone else comes in and they want to do things differently. So there's always going to be challenges around developing relationships with new people. And then probably more specific to the role, I can think of a couple of real key ones without necessarily too much detail unless we want them, but there's always going to be challenges around really key players with a high amount of pressure. They're key players in the team. Everything we do is going to be criticised and analysed, and as soon as there's whether there's a small hiccup or not a small hiccup, every single thing is going to have the spotlight on it around how well you've executed your role, and that's going to be coaching staff, management. And I can think of a couple of key times when things went well, but then necessarily there was questions over players when they were coming back and integrating back in, and then they've returned successfully, and you sort of feel good in that outcome. We had a pretty crucial time. Rugby league people that are across that will know the 2 years ago, Sean Johnson, who was arguably one of the best players in the competition at the time and his best career year. We'd had a great year at the Warriors. He played every game of the year up until the final game where he sustained a calf injury in the second last game of the year, training, which he'd sort of niggled for a little while, and then missed the last game of the year and missed the first finals game. And originally it became a bit of a week to week, like, can we turn him over for the Penrith major semi? No, right. Now we need to turn him over for the elimination final. And that was one of those things where it was every single minute of every day you were thinking about what he was going to be doing every single minute of his day and how we could progress that and decisions. And it was just a constant, felt like every hour you were sort of just second guessing, making sure you had every detail of your plan. And when that came, he didn't, given up a little bit of information here, but he didn't train with the team for, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks in the lead up to the elimination semi-final. We played Newcastle in New Zealand, and he did probably 2 sets of the captain's run the day before the game. We would have been in the team for 2 minutes. He'd done a lot of off the grass running. We tried to get him running in the lead up to the Penrith game and just didn't work well. And so we just took him completely off the grass and did a lot of work in the pool, did a lot of work with some mat drilling, did a lot of strengthening, had as much loading as we could without getting any sort of, just because that low grade bulk trot volume running was not going to be any good for him at that time. We just needed tissue healing time realistically. He did a lot of on grass drilling and things like that. We maintained his kicking load, high contact load, things like that, but he had no running under his belt realistically. And that's the biggest. It was cross your fingers, and you can quiz Balin on how he was going around that time as well, because that was a lot of unknown for us to roll him into that game, to the point where he didn't even do the full warm-up in the game on the way. Like, we were modifying his warm-up in the game in the lead up to Newcastle. So, and then we got out to a nice lead, and he got taken off with probably tomorrow. I can't remember how long to go exactly. It might have been 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the time, 15 minutes. And he got a roaring cheer from the crowd as he walked around from back to the bench. So that was in terms of challenges in that 2 weeks, that could have gone a number of ways, and there was a lot of challenges dealing with that 2 weeks to get him up for that elimination final, and then it just rolled all the way again into the prelim the following week, which he played as well and finished that game. So it was an extremely challenging time around decision making, and you're questioning everything you're doing around that time, and it was definitely not at all by the book around how you would follow a structured rehab and to return a player, but it's probably a good example of how sometimes you just have to go away from what you think you know sometimes to do the best in the scenario and have the outcome that, although we didn't win the preliminary final, he played those last 2 games, and we would have been probably less chance of winning that elimination semi-final if he wasn't out there, even just from the mental boost of the players. I think that's one of the key things that everyone else lifted because he was there, which probably can't be understated as well, just not around his performance but everyone else's performance, because they felt so much secure in him being on the field. So definitely that was, and that ended up being the last 2 weeks of my time in pro sport. So that was an interesting way to go out those last couple of weeks.
Yeah, great result in the end. Was it when you're going through that block week by week, obviously you had Borland to consult and you guys were working collaboratively, but did you have other clubs or other sports that you could lean on that were facing a similar challenge?
It was a very unique one. Obviously felt like at a point we were meeting every day as a staff around what his following day would look like and what he'd done. It wasn't a week to week thing. It wasn't even, I don't even know if it was a day to day thing. It was probably more like a hour to hour situation around, and you were second guessing things a lot of the time. And is this enough? Is it too much? Are we going to be able to make those decisions? And Sean was a huge player in what he felt comfortable with as well. He was a senior player who was very experienced, knew his body really well. So he was extremely vocal in, and understandably so, and what he thought he couldn't get through and what he wanted to do prior to playing, things like that as well. So there was a lot of balls in the air around that. And it would be an outstanding case study to do. And it's one of those situations you never textbook write a rehab in that way to have been completed by any stretch of the imagination. You think you'd ever roll a rehab out over a period of time in that manner. And hopefully I wouldn't have to do it again in a similar situation, but it was just the nature of who he was as a player, his importance to the team and where we were in the season, and the nature of him. We were better off him being out there. And if he got injured, then that was probably a decision that both the club and him and us were willing to take for his importance on the team. So it's definitely a unique scenario that you wouldn't have thought you were going to encounter until that time presented itself realistically.
Yeah, it's a refreshing one as well for, like you're talking about, the player, trusting the player and having their input. It sounds like a lot of it would have been, obviously it can't be research based, it can't be textbook based, so it's got to be gut feel.
Huge.
And back to the what is the athlete feeling? I imagine the whole process was fluid. So that's it's a good one for listeners. That
definitely it wasn't research backed by any stretch of the imagination. There wasn't this nice tiered progression of rehab run loading or speed progression or anything like that. Like, it was trusting the work he got done off the grass and putting a lot of faith. And as you say, like, there's a huge amount of, he developed a large volume of chronic load up to that point. So you're putting a little bit of trust in that and putting a lot of faith in him psychologically, feeling confident in him being able to get the job done, which was a huge player in that as well. So his ability to feel good was going to be probably our biggest influence on whether he felt confident to roll out in that game. So,
and going back to your journey, so educational role, I saw in Exos as well. Obviously, you're in private sector now, co-owner, and then working professional sport. Like, of those sort of 3 different worlds in as a strength coach, is there one that you feel, junior S&Cs that aren't sure where they should start, that you get the most growth or development with to set you up for a long career in the industry? Is there one that you feel like would really set you up for a strong career, or is it something that you just sort of got to go role by role with what's in front of you?
Yeah, I think the opportunity in the private sector is important because it gives you chances to coach and just get a lot of reps in, whether that's, you hear a lot of people advocate for personal training careers, and that's something I did a lot of, which we haven't spoken about, while I was at university. And while I was working in semi-pro roles, I was working outdoor boot camps, personal training in gyms, as I said before, tennis coaching, working with tennis academies. So I think it's just getting a lot of reps and standing up in front of people, feeling more confident in delivering your message. writing programs and making mistakes, and being in those environments, which in back then are a lot more low stress, low risk. You can probably do that safely, but also learn to communicate with a vast variety of people, whether that's you could be working with middle-aged women, youth athletes. So it gives you a broader skill set to be able to juggle a lot of scenarios. So I would definitely encourage any young coaches getting into the mix while they might not be in full-time professional roles, or they might not be in high semi-professional roles. You might be at university, get your qualifications that allow you to just get reps and coach and get in front of people as quickly as possible, because there's probably too many people that are entering pro sport a little bit too raw potentially, and that's probably their downfall. Or a lot of high level of education. They might listen to a lot of podcasts, they might go to a lot of courses and seminars, and they do a lot on the education front and understand the theory extremely well. But until you have that ability to implement that or get exposed to implement that, I think you need to get the reps in as much as you can, as early as you can. So that was definitely something I would not regret. It set me up really well, just in terms of standing in front of a group, even in talking, which sort of factors into the presenting part. I think the best benefit of the presenting part and the Exos thing came out of the blue a little bit. I don't know, Mike Boyle's podcast was probably one of the original S&C podcasts that most people our age would have listened to back in the day. And that was an influence from Timmy Rogers, who got me onto that while I was working as an intern. And they used to have a segment, if you remember, called The Art of Coaching by Athletes, or Athletes Performance, they were called at the time, now Exos. And that sort of got me tied in with them. And then they came out for their mentorship it was held at Richmond, actually, 2011 or so, maybe. There was some that's when I met Lockie Wilmot there for the first time. Selwyn was there. There was a few. Terry Condon was at Richmond at the time. So people that are still high level working in the industry now, and just happened to be on that mentorship at the time. And off the back of that, I did a trip to the States and visited a few of their facilities. And I think I would encourage, that's probably a massive part of it, is when you go to education, I think you get a little bit of a snippet around the theory around how people implement things. I would highly encourage you to go and see those people and spend time with those people and get the actual practical element of how they go about implementing things. A lot of the time in theory, regardless of profession, whether that might be like a Simon Harris who you've had on talking, he's doing a lot of education now in the rehab space and spending a bit of time with how he implements things, whether it's like Alex Natira talking about his ISOs and things like that. I think going and seeing people who are doing the education, watch how they practically implement their systems is extremely important. And that's what Cam and I who did a trip to the States and spent a bit of time in a few of the different Exos facilities watching how they implement their methodology and systems. And off the back of that, they asked me whether I'd like to be a consultant for their education piece. So they had 5 of us worldwide who sort of would tie into their mentorships whenever they came out into different regions. So there was a period of time in Asia Pacific where I was sort of working as a consultant. And I think in getting up and teaching makes you have to understand your content to a higher level. I think you can feel like you know the theory of things, but then as soon as you get to a level where you have to then educate others and teach others on that, probably makes you have to understand it to a higher level as well. So definitely any opportunity for, regardless of the population, you might be working at a local gym and you want to get in front and give a presentation to the members, or whether that's running a high performance seminar or things like that, getting an opportunity to educate others is going to make you have to have a higher level of understanding around your content that you're going to be presenting on. So I think that only transfers extremely well to then your ability to convey that to players or coaches and talk to different levels of the spectrum as well.
Yeah, well said, mate. And from a private sector to pro sport, like for those that want to build rehab experience, what are the different sort of recovery protocols or technology? Is there a big gap between the two? Because I know the private sector is definitely growing a fair bit in Australia.
Yeah, hugely.
With access to Volt equipment and physiotherapists and in-performance gyms. And really, it sounds like pretty much the private sector is pretty much becoming a high-performance space, high-performance environment for all levels of athletes. Is that something that you've experienced, that you're finding, that it's that the gap isn't too big anymore, that there's pretty much the same access to the tools for rehab coaches to use?
I definitely agree. I think as you said, you alluded to the bold stuff. It's nearly become like a competitive advantage from a business perspective that everyone just follows suit a little bit. There's not too many physio clinics and decent high-level strength conditioning gyms around the country that don't have like a full bold suite and things like that nowadays. So there's definitely access to a technology perspective, even from it wouldn't have been that long ago that GPS probably would have been quite unique to the professional, maybe like the VFL semi-pro space. But even now, we work with a couple of contracts with a few local rugby teams, and there's local soccer, NPL soccer teams in Newcastle that have GPS, and they're training like 2 to 3 nights a week part-time. We wouldn't even call it semi-professional realistically. So the access to technology and data these days is probably not a gap anymore, which I feel has its pros and cons realistically. I think as you worked up through those semi-professional roles, you couldn't be relying on a lot of that data. It forced you to develop a coaching eye and have a really good intuition around progression of your programming and things like that. I'm a bit fearful for the coaches coming through those junior pathways, semi-pro, when you've got access to, while in the pro space, you'd never want to take it off you, right? But you want to use it to help you make decisions. But I'm a bit conscious of how young coaches coming through that are going to have GPS access from day one, going to have force plate access from day one, all that sort of stuff, how that's going to mold their ability to coach and trust their coaching eye and make decisions on the fly and be able to adjust and be fluid with their decisions, which I think a lot of it is the benefit early days when you've just got a whistle and a stopwatch. You have to get really good with understanding speed progressions when you're just using your eye and not relying on live GPS and load progressions and the like. So I could be wrong, but I'm a little bit fearful that common access to a lot of that technology could be a hindrance to a lot of coaches moving forward, that they don't develop those skills that you're sort of forced to develop early on. And then you move into the more professional space, and you get the luxury of those things, which you'd hopefully just confirm a lot of the time what you already know, or you're sort of backing up things and helping you make decisions, but not being the things that dictate your decisions, if that makes sense. So that's an interesting one moving forward. I think the biggest difference between private sector and pro space is probably just that link to the skill element. I think there's probably like a little bit of a disconnect in the rehab space. If you think about professionally from an environment, if someone gets injured, touch wood, you don't have anyone, but someone gets injured for you next week, they're moving with you in a rehab setting, you've got a large volume of pre-existing data on them from a baseline data. You might have done baseline assessment on all that VOLD stuff and things like that a lot of the time. Where in the private sector, if it's specifically a rehab client that might walk in post-op ACL, post-Achilles injury, whether that's a soft injury playing locally, you don't have access to all that pre-injury data. So a lot of the time you're using your experience from what you're trying to return them to from where they would be. And then there's probably a slight disconnect with the challenge around the integration, and we spoke about that before, around integrating them back into the training environment and understanding what the coaches' drills look like and what the demands of their sport are a lot of the time. So there's probably each end of the spectrum that you probably lose that pre-injury knowledge that you have in pro sport, or if someone was to get injured. You understand their loads really well. You understand the position you're going to play. You got a good understanding of where they were pre-injury that might have predisposed them to things in the first place. From a rehab perspective, a lot of the time you're sort of going in cold on that information. And then the end stage obviously gets a lot more difficult. I think that middle period when they're under your control is good, but when you're trying to integrate them back into local teams and things like that from a private sector perspective, it's really important that you can try and get an understanding of the sport, whether that's going out to their training or calling the coach and having a good understanding of the sport they're playing, which might be very different to sports who've position they're playing, which might be something you haven't been exposed to in the past. A lot more broader spectrum, obviously, between netball, local touch footy. I mean, we've got athletes who are 45-year-old playing touch football and youth athletes playing basketball. So the scope of that is a lot obviously vastly more broad than the channel of an AFL team or an NRL team or something like that. So probably the biggest challenges from a private perspective that I see in terms of differences.
Yeah. And then moving to like the high performance sort of team in pro setting, whether it was a strong football performance or not, what do you feel like is you can hang your hat as a performance team, whether it be availability or, progress with athletes with their strength numbers or data numbers with their jump tests and max velocity or whatever it might be. What are some of the most important metrics that you feel that the performance teams you've worked with, where you're like, you can hang your hat that we had a great year this year, in helping the club perform, I guess?
Yeah, there's probably availability is always probably going to be the one you're the most critically analysed on as a staff, especially around, probably even more so around key players. There's times when you could probably, as a total number of injuries, you might have less, but if you have some big injuries to key players, then you probably get criticised a little bit more heavily than if you have a larger volume of injuries, which might be to less key players in less important times of the year. Maybe they weren't as longer duration, and there's a lot of luck in it, right? But definitely availability is probably going to be the number one thing you're going to get criticised in your role from a high performance perspective, both physios and S&Cs. And then the second part of that's from a physical performance perspective. You can look at GPS numbers and talk about like how to play, how are we finishing games? It's probably from a fan's perspective and an external perspective that don't access to the numbers. They're always going to judge you on, right, are you getting overrun late in games, or are you finishing strongly to win games? Things like that are probably a little bit more subjective opinions that people are going to judge you on. So, and in the end, from a role, from your job security perspective, you could have the GPS numbers to support things as much as you want, or you could show the strength data around everyone progressing and getting stronger throughout the year. But they're probably the two critical things that external parties, whether it be the board, coaching staff internally, that are going to judge you, GMs are going to judge you on your role, or whether that's externally that's going to put pressure on from a fan's perspective and things like that as well. Even player perception is huge from that perspective too. If they feel like they're finishing games strongly and they feel like they're fit at the end of the game and doing things as opposed to getting overrun, and that's going to be feeling that generates in the group. So probably less around specific, these numbers or key variables are going to be the most important elements. Probably more just the general, the two things that you highlighted. Availability is going to be a key one, and then probably general perception around how you're competing. Like, do the coaching staff feel like you're staying in games? Are you being competitive, physically dominant? How does the physical performance convert over to rugby league? In my example, statistics, like what's your post-contact meters? How are you winning? Are you winning collisions? Are you winning the contacts? How many meters are your outside backs running for? So probably more how the rugby league or sport specific metrics or key variables that they like to look at are influenced from a physical perspective, I think is probably another area you're going to get judged on quite heavily.
Yep. And then from a return to performance, how did you sort of, obviously it is fairly subjective. Obviously, if the athlete doesn't get injured, that's probably a tick.
Yeah.
To a certain degree, but then, yeah, that's return to play, and then the buzzword of return to performance gets thrown around. Do you have like KPIs that is position specific that you come up with the coaches, or is it more subjective on the athlete or the coaches, like rating system? Talk to us about I guess returning players back to their performance, and how you sort of measure, give it a tick, or that maybe they returned to play, but they took them a month to get back to tip top shape. For example.
Yeah, definitely think there's a few variables there. I think there's probably just like a baseline expectation that, one, you're not going to get any other they're not going to pick up any other injuries while they're in rehab. That's probably like a huge red flag. And then the second one is they're not going to get injured, and they're probably just expectations. They're not even like, if you get those two things right, you're not getting a pat on the back. That's just like that's your job. So you better do those two baseline things really well. That's not something that's far and beyond the role. They're just the bottom tier expectations realistically. And they're the two things that if they do happen, you're going to get criticized the most for and ridiculed for and get analyzed around everything you're doing. So your processes then become under high scrutiny. So those two things are probably the base level expectations. Don't pick up another injury and don't get re-injured. The two lowest hanging fruit realistically. The next tier, as you said, your return to performance is, right, when they're integrating back into training, how well are they integrating back into skill drills before they even return to play? And that's that little period between when they transition out of being under your full control in rehab to that transition period before they're returning to full training is probably the most important and trickiest to navigate at times, because there's certain demands that are hard to create in a rehab setting, if you've got one or two players that you need to generate with sheer numbers, but you're in season, they're always going to prioritize the players that they're going to play on a week-to-week basis. You need them to get some opposed or scrimmage minutes at training. And so there's always going to be that period of time where you're trying to push them into as much footy drills as you can. You're talking and discussing with their specific, might be one, if you're a forward, you might be having a lot of the in-depth conversations with the middles coach or the defense coach around the demands and how can we create some drills specific for that player. So there's that bridge around that middle period where you're no longer worrying about tissue healing time, progressions from rehab running. You're not necessarily focusing on the injury as much. You're more transitioning in their ability to perform when they return. And that area is something you're going to get heavily criticized on or critically analysed on, your ability to do your role effectively. How well do they look when they integrate into training, and how quickly can the coaches be confident in picking them after they have integrated back into training? And that's going to be obviously a broad spectrum based on who the player is. And then I think the last layer of that's always going to be the importance of the player to the team. So if you've got a syndesmosis tightrope, for example, that you can turn around in pretty quick time, if that's an important player, then the coach might be happy for you. If we're happy the medical team's happy from an injury perspective, and we know they've got enough work under the belt, that the coach might make a decision that he wants to run the gauntlet and play that player before you would say that they are optimally ready to perform, but they're a little bit underdone. And there's an understanding from the coaching staff that they're going to go in a little bit underdone, and they've made that decision to play them early. Twofold with that, if you're delivering the message that this player is ready, then there's an expectation that that player is ready, which can sometimes be extremely difficult from an in-season period of time. If you think about the preseason, which we're going through that period of time now for a lot of codes, you have a large volume of opposed and scrimmage for everyone. Then you roll into some build-up around game minutes around your trial game 1, trial game 2, building into round 1. And there's that window of opportunity doesn't happen a lot if you're in a rehab setting in season. Maybe you might be able to progress a player depending on who they are through reserve grade, off the bench, certain situations. But a lot of the time, if you've got a high value player, the expectation is that they're just going to be able to roll in and they need to perform from game 1 because you need them to play well to influence the outcome of the game. So there's always going to be a high level of scrutiny around that. In terms of key metrics, I think it's always going to be, it's going to vary massively from position to position. Is this player a bench middle that's going to play 30 minutes? Is this player an 80-minute fullback that's going to have a high volume of high speed running? What are their high performing games or their optimal game, worst case scenario game look like prior to getting injured? What was the injury? Was it an upper limb or lower limb injury? So there's always going to be key variables depending on, at the beginning stages, it's going to be what was the injury and what was the tissue healing and what are the key metrics around the injury. And then the latter stage of that's going to be a lot more specific to the individual and less specific to the injury, more around their ability to perform at a high level when they return into their position. And that's probably the thing that you're going to get a lot of people probably get judged on the most when they were not expecting it early days. Like you think your role is to return the player and you're just worrying about doing the least amount to get them ready that you're happy from an injury perspective, when everyone from a coaching staff perspective is going to analyze your ability to get them to perform optimally, and just there's an expectation they're going to return and be playing at a high level, I suppose.
Well said, mate. That was a thorough response, and no doubt there. I've got a couple of pages of notes from that, but the no doubt listeners are as well. What about the common mistakes, I guess, that you've seen for coaches make with athletes from a strength and power point of view, or reconditioning that listeners could benefit from? Hopefully, don't make themselves or just have awareness around.
Yeah, probably. It's probably a lack of loading a lot of the time. I feel that acute stage is probably a lot more people who could load from a rehab perspective a lot more than they do in the early windows. So having, and again, it can be a relationship with your medical staff. A lot of really forward-thinking medical staff can be really proactive in wanting to load safely early, and then there can be others at times. I've heard stories, and I wasn't exposed to it as much myself, thankfully, but there can be times when a lot of medical staff want to be really, really protective. So, which makes it harder in the back end. So from a strength and power perspective, just understanding what you can do as early as you can do and optimizing your opportunity and your window that you have there, maybe whether that's pre-return to run or while they're returning to run, to get as much into them as you can feel safely. I think I was lucky, and it's probably a little bit of a widespread thing at the moment. There's a lot of people going over to Philly to see Bill Knowles. And I was lucky to be exposed to that a few years ago. We went over with a player and took a lot away from his, and we didn't go over there for an ACL, but I spent a lot of time talking to him about ACLs and other injuries, and the amount of work he's doing extremely early, pre-run, pre-change of direction, but preparing them to do that, and the amount of loading and how early he gets them in the pool and how early he's willing to load graft sites and stuff like that was an interesting thing, which I think a lot of people a lot of the time are a lot more cautious of and scared of, and becomes that trying to hold them back a little bit. And sometimes that can be at your detriment, because at the back end, then you sort of need to try and, you probably do two things. One, you need to accelerate them too much at the back end, which is less ideal. They could have had a little bit more of a base earlier. Or two, you just missed a really good window of opportunity that you could have had to athletically develop a player in the rehab space while they're not playing and dealing with week-to-week contact and things like that. That probably gets avoided. So maybe they've returned really well, but you could have returned them at a higher level that might have set them up really well for a better back end of the year, because you probably haven't taken that window of opportunity as well. So as a general guide, I think probably just not loading enough and early enough at times. Completely disclosure, you need to take in tissue healing times and be working with whether that's surgeons and physio staff and the like. But I always think there's ways that you can try to be progressive with how you go about that safely.
Couldn't agree more. I think it's something you see as you progress a bit more and you experience more coaches that have been doing it at a high level for a long time, how aggressive they are, but it's the dosage is appropriate, the exercise selection is appropriate, and it's no doubt a much better experience for the athlete, where they feel like they're making progress every phase.
A lot of that does come in time as well. Like you see that, once you see that happen successfully a few times, you don't have that hesitation anymore, because you know that you've done it and you've seen it be fine. It's probably just an element of crossing that bridge of realizing that it's always going to be okay, and you don't have to worry about being too paranoid about those things. You sort of just need to get it done.
Yeah, which goes back to what you're saying about going to experts and seeing them operate in their environment.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome, mate. What about the last one on this topic? And I know it's getting close to the end, mate, so we'll start to wrap it up. I appreciate your time, but where do you see the future of private sector and professional sport going? You mentioned how the tech's obviously growing really fast, and that can be of benefit, but also a detriment to coaching and coaching eye. But where do you see rehabilitation and high performance training going for, I guess, the next few years? Where are the new things to come?
New things, yeah. It's an interesting one, and it's probably reverts back to that question I had before. I think things go in cycles a lot of the time, where there's a new wave of tech that comes out, and then everyone has this period of time where everyone gets that exposure to that, and then there's this, all right, there's a large volume of data collection. How are we going to utilize this? How do I understand it? Where does it fit in the puzzle for the program that I'm trying to work with? And then that probably slips into, everyone sort of slips it into a bit more of a, okay, I can utilize it really well for this, and they get really strong understanding of the numbers, and then a new bit of kit comes out or a new bit of tech comes out, and all right, how is this going to influence my decision making? And so I feel like things just continue to undulate with wave of new technology. Everyone sort of reacts and gets exposure to it, and then it's probably just pendulum swings back a little bit, and everyone understands where it fits in terms of their decision making, and then there's something new. So what that new thing is, I'm not really sure, but I know that it'll influence things in the same way, I'd imagine, where it'll be this vast, one person's got it, so everyone has to have it sort of situation. And then there'll be a period of time where there's an understanding around how they can effectively utilize that the most appropriately, and hope what age your decision making, and then how that fits into your program and whether it does or not. And then probably swinging back to what we spoke about before, it's probably a fear from my perspective that some coaches are going to become too reliant on technology because they've never had never not been exposed to it. So I think it's extremely important to have it. It helps with decision making, no doubt. We just don't want it to be the thing that becomes a detriment to our cliche coach's eye, I suppose. And you think about a lot of the people who would be renowned worldwide as being the best coaches. I think they're the guys, especially you think about the Alters crew and track and field, and then a lot of the more senior S&Cs that have been around, rehab specialists that have been around for a long period of time. I think a lot of the decisions they make are from an understanding of experience, but what they're seeing, how's the athlete moving? Are they moving optimally? Do they look different to how they moved last time I saw them run? So being able to make decisions on the fly, and that's probably a worry for me in terms of how things are going to move forward if we just become too reliant on the numbers and someone's feeding me live GPS metrics into my ear and you become too rigid with those things, not being able to adjust on the fly. So I hope that doesn't happen. And the people and the staff and the coaches that don't fall into that trap will be the ones that continue to progress the most, I feel. Being able to use the numbers to their advantage to aid them making decisions, but not solely making decisions based off them.
Yeah, 100%. We're going to be informed, but yeah, not dictated by. Others. Couldn't agree more.
Great way of saying it.
What about work life, mate? Do you have any pet peeves? Anything that sort of fires you up from an industry perspective?
They'd probably be very similar than a lot of them. I think it's the nature of the world we live in at the moment. There's a large volume of access to information, positive, which has positive and negative effects, of course. There's a lot of people that can get themselves a strong following that might not necessarily be portraying a really, really good message. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that can be highly influenced if they don't have the knowledge to critically analyze the information they're receiving. So that's probably one thing that's a little bit of a worry in just the world we live in at the moment. So I challenge people to always think critically and think about the information that someone's giving them and don't just take their word for it and don't take everything as gospel. Probably is one of the biggest pet peeves of mine when you sort of see people just see something and run with it a little bit. From a work perspective, I think high performance sport, you're always going to struggle because there's so much pressure around people's roles, but there's always going to be this element of, unfortunately, people trying to do things to protect their own jobs at times and things like that as well, which is unfortunate in the industry. And luckily in the last period of time, when you have a really good team you work with, that's sort of something you can avoid. You can put trust in other people to do their roles effectively and go to people for guidance. But I think there's times when things aren't ideal in that setting, people become very protective of their own work or think that their way is the only way of doing things, can be very insular in how they want to operate and things like that. That's obviously less than ideal, whether that's a pet peeve or just the nature of, unfortunately, the industry we're in when it's so cutthroat. There's always going to be an element of people, some people, not far from everyone, but some people obviously just trying to protect their own self-interests, I suppose. And I think that's probably the unfortunate nature of the industry a little bit, where there's people that are a little bit that way. But no, I think like any industry, workmate, there's always going to be certain elements that are less than desirable around the industry that you work in, but the good people will always sort of come to the fore, hopefully, and the intelligent ones will always have the ability to read the room a little bit and be a little bit more critical of the information that they're absorbing. Probably my biggest two things.
And favorite way to spend a day off?
Oh, I left pro sport to have more time with the family and things like that, and it hasn't panned out as much as I would like at this stage. With the business side of things, is definitely taken more of a lead than I would have liked. But as you'll establish when you're in town next week for your trial game, Newcastle's a very nice place to be. So I've got wife and two kids that we'll spend a bit of time, kids' parks and the beach and pool, and getting them out there as active as we can and wearing the two kids out. So when I do get some time off, man, it's usually spent with the family.
Yep. And obviously it's recording early in the year, like early February of 2025. What's on the horizon? What are you most excited about for the rest of the year?
Yeah, work-wise, mate, as we spoke about earlier on, Cam and I have got a lot of ideas around how we want to build the business, and I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of good things in Australia. It's probably that private sector is really building, and there's a lot of people rolling out on the education front, facilities front. The last few years, it's probably really skyrocketed, and we're just hoping we can add to that. I suppose we've got a big plan around some education. Both of us really enjoy that side of things and teaching and presenting, and we feel like we can add to the space that's already got a lot of good things going on in that area around Australia. But that rehab space and performance space, and there's a lot of things we could draw from our experiences to all levels, whether you're just coming through in the industry. So that's definitely an area that we're really looking forward to, and then just continuing to build a business and get my head around the whole other side of the business things that I've never really been exposed to before. Was never hugely social media savvy or anything like that. So the nature of the beast with the world we live in a little bit at the moment from a business and marketing perspective, just getting your head around how that's best optimized and business structure and behind the scenes and a lot of the things that you don't get exposed to from a pro sport perspective, and seeing how that all unfolds for us from a business perspective with our memberships and things like that as well. So it's going to be an exciting year for growth for us, hopefully, and that's definitely the main focus for us. Secondly, to that, part of the business, we have a few contracts where we're still working with teams. So I'm still working with some semi-pro rugby, which I never worked in rugby until last year when I came home. So there's a few semi-pro rugby teams that hopefully we can have another successful season with. So still keeping foot in the door in the team space as well, which is exciting too. So definitely enough to stay busy for the next 12 months or so.
Oh, absolutely. Sounds like it, mate. And for strength and conditioning coaches listening, so there'll be educational presentations to come. What's sort of the timeline are you thinking?
Our first one's going to be lower limb rehab for sports, so just around return to play frameworks that would be tailored more anywhere, I suppose, from a pro sport perspective, but also to private physios, S&Cs, around how they can optimize those things. That'll be Cam and I presenting together, so it'll sort of be an acute phase to late stage, both on the field, practical, and in theory-based content. We'll probably roll that out off-season, end of this year, so we'll sort of develop it, and you'll probably see the advertising for that come out middle of the year. So that'll be an off-season education thing for a lot of people. September, October time is the plan around that, and we may roll out a few little smaller snippets around that in the short term in the lead up to that. But September, October is probably we're going to roll out our first main mentorship over several days, which will be exciting to see how that's received.
Awesome. Yeah, well, for those that tuned in that have some follow-up questions and also want to check out the website and the space that you've got in Newcastle, where's the best place to connect, mate?
Instagram socially, so RAF_sports_ is our Instagram handle. You can jump on there, and there's only been a small amount of content gone up there so far, but that's definitely something we're looking forward to ramping up significantly in the next few weeks and months. So not sure when this is going live on the interwebs podcast world, but hopefully by the time some people are listening to it, if they're not tuning in, there'll be a lot more content up there as well. So you can definitely ask questions and send us some messages on that front. Website is www.rafsports.com.au, so you can email us through that. And my email address is matt@rafsports.com.au as well. So feel free to reach out if you've got any questions or anything of that nature. If you're ever in Newcastle and want to stop in and have a look at how we're operating, by all means, I've had a lot of people be amazingly receptive to opening their doors to me over the time of both teams and private sports. Got back. Sorry, I lost you there for a sec. I was just saying, if anyone's ever in Newcastle, by all means, reach out, and happy to have a chat and things like that as well. So,
yeah, perfect. Awesome, mate. Yeah, well, thanks again for jumping on your Saturday afternoon to have a chat. I've taken a lot from it, obviously from a selfish perspective, being in a rehab role, but no doubt the listeners, both S&Cs and athletes, have as well. If you tuned in halfway through on the YouTube live or just at the end there, make sure to listen to the very start about Matt's journey in pro sport, and also what he's doing at Rough Sports now in his own business. But really appreciate it, Matt. And we'll add the show notes as well. Rough Sports Instagram, stay tuned, obviously, for the presentations and mentorship to come. And as soon as the website's live, we'll add that in the show notes as well, mate. So everyone can access it easily there. Yeah, perfect.
Mate.
Thanks for everyone tuning in. And our next live chat's with James Wild, which is pretty soon as well, on the 13th of February. So if you want to jump in our next live for those tuning into this one, that'll be at 8:30 p.m. the 13th of February. So I look forward to seeing you guys then.
Mate, thanks for having me on. Hopefully we can catch up in town when you're in town next week. It'd be good to chat in person.
Absolutely. No, we'll do. Yeah, looking forward to come down to Newcastle. Sounds beautiful.
See you in a second.